Let's get started. We're going to cover international trade. So we're going to be using stuff from chapter 2 and 18. You just need to know what the topics are that I'm covering in the actual lecture slides. So we're basically just going to look at comparative and absolute advantage, and we'll do an example of how you can get gains from trade, and we'll look at the effect it would have on the production possibilities curves. In terms of coverage, we're going to be covering chapter 2 and also a small portion of chapter 18. Just focus on pages 587 to 591. There has been huge changes in the level of trade in the last few decades. So if you look at the graph here, it's pretty obvious. If we look at 1950, there wasn't that much trade going on between nations. And look how much it's skyrocketed since then. It's roughly 40 times more than what it was in the 1950s. So you're talking, massive growth. And basically it picked up deeply in around 1995. I mean, you had some pretty good increases before then, but around the mid-1990s, it really took off since the establishment of the World Trade Organization. If we were to look at an average annual growth rate here, we're talking something like 5% per year. So it's quite substantial. If we look at Canada, you can see 1981, we had some trade, but if you look now, it's gone up, substantially since then. For example, in 2018, we exported roughly $700 billion of goods and services and imported 753, so just, a little bit above that. We can see here in the figure that this bottom line here is whether we've had a trade deficit or surplus. So this is just your net exports, right? So if you remember, as part of the equation, X minus M, that's what this line here would be. And so for the most part, we had a trade surplus. And then you can see here, we've had some areas here where we had a trade deficit. We export a lot of oil and other natural resources. So that's partly why we see Canada having a trade surplus. But, prices of oil have changed. That can substantially impact this. Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of trade. Canada is one of the largest trading nations in the world. Can anyone guess who our largest trading partner is? It's the U.S. It's not just by a small margin. Most of our trade is with the United States. We sell over twice as much to the United States as all other countries combined. So you can see here, looking at exports, almost $500 million per year with the United States. And we do a lot of trade with the European Union. China is also a large trading partner. This is 2018, but it just gives you a sense of, the amount of trade with other countries. So here, this is if we were to look at the share of world, China exports the most in the world to different countries. The United States comes in second, and then Germany. And again, this is 2000. So the point with these slides basically highlight there's a lot of trade going on in the world, especially since the World Trade Organization established. And Canada is in relative terms, we're quite large. If you were to think of just in terms of our percent of GDP, in terms of trade, Canada's a very large trade. Of course, we're very small, right? So in terms of total dollar volume worldwide, we're not very large. But if you look at per capita basis, we're quite large. So drives international trade? Well, I mean, basically, there's gains from trade. What really drives it is, for the most part, some countries can do stuff better and cheaper than other countries, right? So really, we'll talk about comparative advantage, but it's really a driving force behind trade. So I mean, we'll talk about exactly what comparative advantage is, but really, when you think of comparative advantage, you can think of opportunity cost. For example, if you're thinking of, say, tropical fruit, well, countries with warm climates would have a lower opportunity cost of producing these types of fruit than, say, Canada. We, especially think of the winter months, we could produce bananas and this sort of thing in greenhouses, but it would cost a tremendous amount of money, and our opportunity cost would be very high, right? All of those resources that we'd have to put towards growing tropical fruits in the winter would be, very, very costly. So other countries can do it at a lower opportunity cost. So just in terms of a brief history, there's sort of three different ideas that are important here. Mercantilism, this is sort of us versus them. Basically, the idea is that you can gain, but at the expense of others. It kind of misses a very important aspect of trade, the gains that can occur, and it assumes a zero-sum game. A lot of writing was done back in 1776 with Adam Smith, and then we'll talk about different idea. Basically, absolute advantage is sort of a special case of a bigger theory, comparative advantage, which was put forth in 1817 by David. Basically, when you have countries specializing and doing what they're good at and then trading with each other, you get a bigger economic pie than if everyone tried to do it on. That's the main idea. So mercantilism was sort of the main school of thought back, in Europe throughout the late Renaissance and early modern periods. You're thinking 15th to 8th century. With this, it's a simple idea, right? The primary objective was to increase the power of the nation state. So, especially in time, you can think in this time too, a lot of trade was done with precious metals like gold and silver. So the idea here was that countries wanted to sort of export as much as they can and not import, so they can increase their amount of gold or silver. So you can think of that the nation's wealth depends on accumulated treasure. So in this sense, you're export as much as you can, encouraging domestic production, discouraging imports, and the focus would be on a trade surplus. So you'd want to maximize exports through subsidies. So you could subsidize domestic firms so that their costs are lower, and then they're able to sell to the rest of the world at a better price. And you want to minimize imports through tariffs. But as we'll see, this isn't a very smart idea. It's there's a lot missing. It's assuming that basically it's a zero-sum game, which it's not. And that's because of specialization. And both countries can gain if they were trade. So, and this has been understood since the late Victorian era. The main benefits from trade, because people can do different things at different costs. Some countries are better than others. So it makes sense for countries to do what they're good at and then trade. And this, you don't have to just think of a country. You can think of this it's a general concept, right? Just think of your family household. If you didn't, you're trading with the grocery store. You're trading with businesses every day. It would be impossible for you to produce on your own everything that you consume. And if you want to get a sense for the benefits of trade, just think of if we were to close London, Ontario off, put some sort of walls around London, Ontario, and not trade with anybody, would we be better or worse off? Well, we'd be much worse off. We wouldn't have enough people to sustain an automobile industry, so we probably wouldn't be able to make cars. We wouldn't be able to, reasonably produce any fruits or vegetables in the wintertime. If we did, they would be very expensive because you'd have to greenhouses. You could just, very easily see, like, we wouldn't have smartphones. There'd be a ton of different products that we wouldn't be able to have. And then obviously you can see, okay, well, let's just trade with a few other cities. No, we would be a little bit better off. And, so what's the distinction then between national borders? Now, there's all kinds of other issues that could be negative that come up with international trade. There's, concerns about exploiting labor. There's concerns about, sort of exporting pollution and those sorts of things. So, it's not a perfect, it's not going to be all great without any negatives, but I think most economists would agree that the overall benefits outweigh the costs when it comes. So there's a link here to a good article if you want more background on this. So the theory of absolute advantage, this was first talked about in Adam Smith's popular book, The Wealth of Nations. So basically he's just talking, so absolute advantage just means, if, Canada would have a certain absolute advantage at, say, lumber, we have lots of it. We can maybe produce it cheaper than another country. You could just think of absolute advantage just means that if a country has it, it just means they're able to produce more for, in terms of productivity. So their productivity at making a certain service is higher than another country. And so this idea of absolute advantage would be to produce, only goods that you're really efficient and then trade those for which you're not, which is the main idea. But as we'll see, this is basically a special case of overall better idea of comparative advantage. So Adam Smith, did his writings in 1776. He, was pointing out the flaws with mercantilism, and he, says that in the long run, it, only enriches a few and it weakens the country long term. He argued against the belief that, that it was a zero-sum game. It's not just a set economic pie or amount of wealth that you should be concerned about with trade. Because there's such massive gains that you can have. If you do it right, you get a much larger economic pie. And it's not always bad. If you think about having a trade deficit, well, it really depends on the context whether a trade deficit is good or bad. Just think about if the only trade Canada did was to buy fruits and vegetables in the wintertime, we would always have a trade deficit, right? But is that necessarily a bad thing? No, because we can get fruits and vegetables at a much lower cost than if we tried to do them ourselves, right? So when someone says a trade balance is good or bad, without giving any other information, it's not very clear if it's actually good or bad. You need to know the context, what's actually going on. What is the trade composed of? If we're having a persistent trade deficit, maybe just on consumption goods, we're just buying a lot of beer or alcohol or something like that, then yeah, maybe it's not a great thing. But it's much more complicated than that. His main point was that it's a positive sum game. When you have countries specializing, both nations will gain. You get a larger economic pie for which you can all share. So how could a country have an absolute advantage? Well, it could come from anything that would relate to better productivity, like skills, equipment, natural resources. So you're just endowed with certain natural resources that other countries don't have. These are where they would come from. A country would have a great advantage in pineapple if it has the right weather, right? And if it has a tropical climate. But the same country would be at a disadvantage in growing some other types of, right? So they may be really good. They have the right soil for pineapples, but maybe they could grow coniferous trees, but the soil may not be all that great. They might not be very good trees. You got the idea. So basically the idea is specialize in what you have an advantage, an absolute advantage in, and then you can get a larger, so it's fairly straightforward. If we look at the table below, so this is just a numerical example to get the idea. You have two countries, Fredonia, Liberland, and both countries make beer and wine. So in this setup here, these numbers are referring to the productivity. So you can think of this maybe as output per person or something like that. So here in this example, Fredonia would have an absolute advantage in beer production because they can get more unit per input, or in this case, so here we're thinking on average 4 units of beer per person would be their productivity. Where Liberland, they have an absolute advantage in wine production compared to the other countries. So looking at these numbers to understand them, we would say that in Fredonia, they can produce 4 units of beer per person, but for wine, if they were to try to make wine, they would only be able to produce, 1 unit of wine per person. Whereas in Liberland, they can make 4 units of wine per person. They're not too bad at making beer, but Fredonia is, a bit better. Their productivity is 1. So in this case, it makes sense, right? Obviously, if each country produced on their own beer, and they're going to have less of it than if they were to each to specialize in beer and wine and then sell to each other, because you're going to have a much larger economic pot. Just to get a hint, an idea of that, suppose each country had 20 million people and they split the number of workers 10 million in each industry. What would be the total output of the two countries? Well, in Fredonia, for beer, we would have, 4, this is the productivity per person. So we multiply this 4 by 10 million. And then for wine, we would multiply 1 by 10 million. And then, again, do the same. And when we do that, this is the total amount of production we would get. So Fredonia would be able to make 40 million units of beer, and 10 million units, this would be 10 million units of wine, 30 million of beer for Liberland, and 40 million of wine. So the total then would be, the total economic pie of beer and wine would be 70 plus 50 if they were to each specialize. So let's just have Fredonia make beer and Liberland make wine. Well, we would end up with each. So again, remember there was 20 million workers. So instead of putting 10 million workers in sector, you would put them all in one sector. So now Fredonia can make 80 billion units of beer because they're going to have 20 million workers. So 20 times 4 is the 80. And then same with the other country in terms of wine, they could make 80 million units. Clearly here now we have a much larger economic pie of these two goods. We would have 80 million plus 80 million. Without trade, we would have only had 70 and 50. So very, obviously, it's very intuitive. If you have people do what they're good at, put all of their resources into that, and then you just have that, you can trade with each other. So there'd be some, in terms of trade that would make sense, and you would, negotiate that, and both would end up with more. And, the idea would apply to more than just two goods. And so again, this is just an example with, each country in this example has an absolute advantage over the other. And so again, here the gains were 10 and 30. But again, this is just absolute advantage. You could have it that, so this is the next person that came out here, David Ricardo. He came out with a more comprehensive theory and showed that absolute advantage is sort of a special case. What really matters is the relative activity or the opportunity cost. So what really matters is if a country can produce something at a lower opportunity cost than another country. And you could have one country having an absolute advantage in both goods, and you could still benefit from, and we'll see that in. So basically, again, to recap, it's comparative advantage that, promotes the gains from trade, which just simply means that one country having a lower opportunity cost than another. And again, like for my example, Canada would have a very high opportunity cost of producing tropical fruits compared to a country that has the climate for them. So yeah, you could think of, different countries are going to have different opportunity costs. So we're thinking about, okay, well, if they produce the good, they have a high opportunity cost. That means they have to give up a lot. So if a country is not good at something for whatever reason, they could just not have the skills or capital for that. Or thinking of the natural resources required for producing that. If they're not very good, then they're going to have a very high opportunity. So he said, countries should specialize in terms of which good is relatively more productive, relatively. And again, a country could have an absolute advantage in, say, either good, but there could still be gains for trade between two countries. The main point, again, is that absolute advantage is just a case of comparative. So in this example here, we have two countries, the United States and the Philippines. There's a question. Oh, so the amount of time taken to produce the wine and beer is embodied in that figure, right? That figure is output per. Anytime you have a productivity figure, it implicitly is assuming some unit of time in there, right? So here we're saying that, for example, in this country, on average, they would be able to produce 4 units of wine per person per unit of some time. That is implicit in this number. Does that make sense? That was Ernesto. Does that make sense? So here we have an example where we have two countries, and clearly here the United States has an absolute advantage in both wheat and bean. So and the other country, the Philippines, is clearly does not have an absolute advantage, right? So in terms of wheat, the United States can produce 4 units of wheat per person per some unit of time compared to the Philippines. So maybe the Philippines they don't have the right soil right? So they have some soil. And so if they were to try and grow wheat, there would be a huge, if they were, so if they were trying to grow wheat, they would have a large opportunity cost, we'll see. And then if we look at bean production, well, Philippines is not too bad. They're just, 1 unit in terms of productivity, lower than the United States. But still, they don't have, the United States here clearly has an absolute advantage over producing wheat and bean. So naively, you may think, well, then there would be no reason for these two countries to get involved in trade because there would be no gains from trade. I think that, though, you would be mistaken, as we'll see. So what we want to do is look at the opportunity cost of producing each of the two goods for each of the two countries. Then we can make a statement about who should specialize. So if we look at United States, right? So let's look at the table at the top first. The United States can produce wheat and beans, and the productivity for each is 4. So if the United States had to grow wheat instead of beans, then their opportunity cost is 1. It's a 1-for-1 basis, right? Because the productivity is same. And so in terms of 1 unit of wheat, if the United States grows 1 unit of wheat, then they gave up their opportunity cost was also 1 unit of bean, right? Because they're equally productive between the two. So for the United States, the opportunity cost of producing wheat is just 1 bean. That's what you'd have to give up. Produce bean instead of wheat. For each unit of beans, you would be giving up one. Again, that's because the activity here is. Now, if we look at the Philippines, if the Philippines produces 1 unit of wheat, well, they would be giving up 3 units of. Sorry, I was just looking at the chat to see if there's any more comments. So again, yeah. We look at Philippines, if they grow 1 unit of wheat, well, they could have used those resources and made beans, right? So they'd be giving up 3 units of beans. If they grow beans instead of wheat, then they're only giving up 1/3 of a unit of wheat, because each, unit of labor can make 3 beans. So if you use that labor to make beans, you'd be able to make 3 units of beans, and you'd only be giving up, 1/3 of. Okay, so this is in this example, we can see different opportunity costs here, and again, the Philippines is not good at making wheat, right? So when they're not good at something, you see that the opportunity cost is very high, and that's what we're seeing here. The opportunity cost for them of growing wheat is very high. They would be giving up 3 units of bean, whereas in the United States, they would only be giving up 1 unit. Now, in terms of beans for wheat, again, Philippines, they would only be giving up 1/3 of wheat. So we can see here that the United States has a comparative advantage in wheat production. So we're just going to look, okay, for wheat, who has the lowest opportunity cost? Well, the United States does. For beans, who has the lowest opportunity cost? Well, it's the Philippines. And, whatever numbers you're given here, you'll always find this pattern where you can always identify country having a comparative advantage over the other. And you can see these numbers are reciprocal. At the worst, you might get where they're equal, so it could be either or. But you'll never get where, just the way the math would work out, you'll never get one country having a comparative advantage. Okay, so let's see if, if there's any gains from trade that these two countries can get if they specialize. So that's what we're going to do in the next few slides. So again, we're going to say that the U.S. has a comparative advantage because it gives up less wheat than the other country. And the Philippines has a comparative advantage beans because they give up less wheat if they were to make beans than the United States. So we'll see that they both do better still from trade. So again, they both, remember, the United States, the whole point of this example is that the United States here has an absolute advantage in both. So if they never traded, so we're going to use our production possibilities curve to illustrate this. So again, if you look at this, you'll see the exact same pattern as before, but here we're given what else, we're not just given the extreme. So here we're given that if the United States were to put all of its resources towards wheat production, they'd be able to make 400 million bushels per day. And if they put all of their effort into beans, they'd be able to make 400 million per day. And then there's, intermediate case. They could put some resource toward beans and the rest to wheat, and they, can do the intermediate. If we look at the Philippines, they put all of their effort into making wheat, they'd be able to produce 100 million. And then if they put all of their effort into bean production, they'd be able to get 300. And so this there's nothing new here. We just, this restores, this is keeping intact the productivity. So clearly here again, you can see that the United States has an absolute advantage in both wheat and beans production, because if they put all their resources wheat, they're going to be able to make more than the other country. If they put all of their resources into the other good beans, they're still going to be able to. So we can think of these numbers are just coming from a certain amount of labor. Now let's suppose that before trade, they are happy, they prefer these points here. So the United States prefers to produce, given the preferences of their own citizen, preferences for these two goods, this is what they would produce. So 240 and 160. Philippines, if they're on their own, they would want to produce 80 million bushels of wheat and 60 million bushels of bean. And so in total, if we're thinking of the total economic pie of both countries here, we would have 320 million bushels of wheat, 220 million bushels of bean, right? So the total economic pie would be 320 units of wheat, million bushels, and 220 million bushels of bean. So let's suppose specialize in what they have to compare their comparative advantage. So then, of course, the United States is just going to produce 400 units, and the Philippines will produce 300. And so So now compared to, up here, I put the total economic pie if they were not trading, and so they just independently on their own produce wheat and beans. Remember the totals were 320 and 220. Well, obviously, if they specialize in what they have a comparative advantage at, clearly there's gains for trade here because we would have 400 million bushel wheat. So the United States could just say, okay, we're not going to make any beans. We're going to put all those resources wheat, and they'd be able to get 400. And then the other country, the Philippines, they're not going to bother making any wheat. They're just going to produce beans, and they would produce 300 million bushels. So yeah, you see that 400 minus 320 gives you 80 or 80 million bushels more wheat. And then if we look 300 beans, subtract 220 beans, the gain from beans would also be 80 million. So clearly there'd be a bigger economic pie here if they were to specialize. And so then now, you just need to figure out what they would want to trade it at. So they would need to come up with, some terms of trade. So basically, what price will they trade with each other? Well, you could just think about it. The United States, if they were to make 1 unit of wheat, they'd have to give up. So they'd be, happy with any, giving up, less one bean, So, you just got to think about, okay, on their own, what's their cost? And then you see that there would be some room for, a range in which there'd be a terms of trade that would be favorable for both of them, that they both would want to agree on. So without trade, it costs 1 unit of beans, right, to get 1 unit of wheat. You could think of 1 beans for 1 wheat. And so this is the price in terms of wheat. So they would never accept anything. So remember, again, what they're specializing in. So the United States would specialize in wheat. So they would make wheat. So they would never, accept anything than 1 bean per unit of wheat, because that's what they can do that on their own, right? And so they would never accept anything less than 1 unit of bean for a unit of wheat. If X was this price, so let's suppose that the price, we're going to define a price here as beans per wheat, then X would have to be, at least equal to Philippines. So without trade, it costs 3 units of beans to get 1 unit of wheat. And again, remember, they're going to be specializing bean production. So without trade, if they wanted to make wheat, they would have to give up, 3 unit of beans. So they would never pay more than, what it would cost them normally, which would be 3 units of bean or 1 unit of wheat. So as long as the price, defined as per wheat, they'd be happy with anything less than 3. And so obviously then there's a range here that's beneficial for both, right? So the US, as long as the price is over 1, they're happy. And for the Philippines, as long as the price is below 3, they're happy. So, there's a range here. They would, this would be something they would negotiate. And as long as it's between this range, they're both going to be better off. So let's just assume that they negotiate a terms of trade of 1 unit of wheat per, 1 unit of wheat costs 2 units of beans. So this price in terms, beans for wheat is 2, right? So basically they have agreed that, so the U.S. is agreeing here to 2 units of beans for every unit of wheat that they produce. So if we look here before trade, so if they didn't trade, these are the figures here from before, they would produce 60 million bushels of beans, and they would produce 80 million bushels of wheat. This is the Philippines before trade. And so their total, economic pie, you could say, is, 80 units of wheat and 60 units of beans. We look down below, this would be the United States. This is at their point on their production possibilities curves, where they would prefer on their own, if they didn't do any trade, to have 160 million bushels of beans and 240 million bushels of, okay, so yeah, that's before trade. So now let's think about what happens when they do trade. So we know that when they trade, well, first of all, we have the terms of trade up here. 1 unit of wheat, is equal to 2. So before trade, it would be 60. We have 80. So now the Philippines is going to trade with the United States. We're assuming, they're going to specialize in what their comparative advantages. So then the Philippines then is going to produce 300 million bushels of beans, right? We know that, so they're both going to specialize. So if we just look at this box here, this is how much beans are going to be produced in total. They're only going to be 5 Philippines. And so here we have the 240 that the United States would want to, this on their own, the United States would want to buy 240 million. Again, we got to remember who's producing what here. So the United States is is going to specialize in wheat, right? So the United States only wants 240 million bushels. So they'd be happy to sell the rest, right? So let's suppose they sell the rest of that wheat. So they're going to be able to make 400. So if you look here, if they specialize in wheat, they're going to be able to make 400 million bushels. And so they're, happy to only keep what they want, to get the 240. So whatever that difference is. So, and then they can export it. And then, so 120 million bushels of wheat is going to get you, 240. That's the terms of trade, right? It's 1 to 2. So after trade, then we would have beans produce 300 million bushels. The Philippines would export 240 million bushels of beans. In return, they would get 120 million bushels of, okay, so we're saying here that the Philippines is going to export this amount of beans in return for this amount of, and so, this is what they're going to end up with. So in this case, they're going to stick with their original 60 million bushels of beans, right? So in terms of beans, they're same as what they would be if they didn't trade. But if you look at wheat, they're much better off, right? So instead of just having 80 million bushels of wheat, they would now have 120 million. Now, if we look at the United States, before trade, they're not going to have any beans, right? But they're going to import 240 million units of beans. So this is their gains from trade, right? They would definitely be gaining on, the 240 is much larger than the 160, right? Again, on their own, if they didn't trade, they'd only have 160 million bushels of beans, but now they would have 240. They're going to, keep, so, they can, without trade, produce 240 million bushels of wheat, but now they're going to make 400, but then trade 120. And so then they're left with 280. So here the gains would be 80 beans and 40. So again, the whole point here is that even though the United States has an absolute advantage in both of these goods, still be beneficial for them for both countries to engage. So, you're getting a much larger economic pie. And then we can see this more easily just from looking at the production possibilities curve. So this is the production possibilities curve. This is what, that table that we looked at earlier, this is what it looks like if you were to plot it. So we have 400. Remember, if the United States put all of their resources in wheat, they could make 400 million bushels. So that would be this point here. If they were to put all of their resources in production, that would be this point here. And so this is their production possibilities curve before any trade. And then now we just need to know the terms of trade and we can compare it to that. So we know that they negotiated a 1-to-2 ratio for their terms of trade. So you can think of, okay, if they trade, then the United States is going to make 400 million bushels of wheat, and they're going to be able to get 2 units of beans for each unit of wheat. And so that's this line here. So this line here is just the terms of trade, and it's going to be, so if you could, to think about how to plot it, you only need to know what this number here is. Well, then what's this number here? Well, this is if they were to sell all of their wheat at the terms of trade, 400 million bushels, they would get, 800 million beans, right? Because of the terms of trade is 1-to-2. And so this is essentially, through trade, the production possibility curve is extended and to the left. It's rotated over here, to the right. All this shaded between these two lines is essentially the potential gains from trade. So the slope of this line here is the terms of trade. And again, it's to the right of the original production possibilities curve. Now we can do the similar exercise for the Philippines. So before trade, if they put all of their effort into wheat production, they would be able to make 100 million of wheat. And if they were to put all of their resources in bean production, they'd be able to 300 million bushels. But now, they can trade the beans for wheats at a 1-to ratio. So they would produce so if they're specializing, you could think of them being at this point initially, right? They're going to produce 300 million bushels of beans, and then trade them for wheat. So so for every 2 beans, they get 1 unit of wheat. That would be the slope of this line here. And so what's this point? Well, if they were to sell all of their beans to the U.S., what would they get given the terms of trade that they negotiated? Well, they would get half, 150 billion bushels and so that's better than they could do on their own. Again, you have, clearly you have a pushing out of the production possibilities because of trade. And so that's the end of the course. It was a great, now we're at the end of the course. It was a pleasure teaching everybody, and I hope you have a great summer. Take care for now.